One of our YouTube listeners in Florida wrote to me a couple of years ago and very apologetically told me that he had decided to go back to a traditional Roman Catholic church. Of course, I never tell anyone to quit going to any church. I mean, that's not my business to tell people where they should go to church. But like many of us who are here, he was someone who had been a very faithful follower and a believer in the formal teachings of the church. But once he had done enough reading and thinking for himself, he found that he just couldn't go back. And as you've heard me say before, while we cherish the teachings of Jesus, we're not very interested in the teachings about him, which seem to be mired in Iron Age mythology. Now, this listener didn't stop believing in the truth of his late-in-life discoveries of a more honest, academic, and fact-based faith, but rather he willingly elected to embrace a kind of self-deception. That is, he felt his advancing years leading up to a sudden end, and he didn't want to face death without some promise, some assurance of eternal life in something like a Catholic vision. Now, I don't think I could personally do that. I turned 60 this summer, so I guess the sand is kind of falling through the hourglass pretty quickly at this point in life. But I don't think I could put the genie back in the bottle. If a traditional church should try to make one of those offers you can't refuse to me, I don't think I could go back into the world where I lived for 30 years of doing midnight Christmas vigils and Easter sunrise services and trying to assure people in funerals of a certain afterlife that is anything but certain. But folks do it. There are people who do it. There are people that go to graduate school, they learn a fact-based theology, and then they go into churches and repeat childish myths for their entire career, and they do it. But it has become something of a hobby for me to look for examples in historical literature of signs and suggestions of progressive faith breaking out in sometimes poetry or philosophy or in theology prior to the wave of historical Jesus scholarship of which we are a part. I mean, our church's existence in many ways depended upon the creation of the last 20 years of the literature of the Jesus Seminar. But it wasn't just discovered in this generation, nor was it just discovered in the post-World War II publications of people like Tillich and Bultmann and Kasiman. It's no longer surprising to me to encounter someone who writes as if they had managed to just stumble out of the darkness of a cave into the light of reason. I was delighted to discover a book by H.L. Mencken published in 1930 entitled A Treatise on the Gods. Now, Mencken didn't just stumble out of the darkness. He was an old school scholar. That is, he didn't have a formal education. He had one of the first degrees from a correspondence school in America, but he was largely a self-taught person, and he was a journalist, which, you know, lowers the bar. You don't expect as much, but he and he wasn't universally a very nice guy. I mean, really, he was a racist. He lived in Baltimore and wrote for the Baltimore Sun in the early part of the 20th century, and he said a lot of things that were really pretty bad. But his criticism of politics was disarmingly insightful, oftentimes very witty, and occasionally just absolutely cut to the bone of politics in that era. But when he turned his sights on religion, he produced a scathing review of the absolutely silly things that religious people believe. The book is really, I recommend it to you. It's an entertaining read, and it's well researched and written by a guy that had virtually no theological education. He was self-taught. I was delighted to find an early 20th century myth buster who did not have the benefit of a German New Testament education at the time. What I found, though, in this quote that I used as our wisdom lesson today, there was something that I'd never thought about, was his commentary on the failure of the Lutheran Reformation. Like every other seminary student in the world, I had a cursory introduction to the history and writing of that great German reformer, but I had never given a moment's thought to how Luther, on the one hand, became famous for being able to see through the absurdities of papal authority and the abuses of the formal church, but then he very quickly found himself engaging in battles with Protestant rivals. His original argument was everyone should be able to read the Bible in their own language and discern for themselves what their faith should be. And then once he was being successful in that enterprise, he discovered that he really didn't like what most people thought about what they read. And he began to write books and letters in which he empowered himself as an authority to be condescending and dismissive of people who somehow had been given a Bible in their own language and still didn't have the good sense to agree with him. The Protestant Reformation did change the Western world. The incestuous relationship between government and the Catholic Church that had ruled Europe for 1,000 years came to a virtual end within the lifespan of a single person. And that is amazing, because typically the world doesn't change that fast that much. There were very influential anti-Reformation movements within the Catholic Church. The whole work of St. Ignatius of Loyola was really an attempt at quashing the Protestant Reformation and reinstituting the Catholic Church as the only true faith. However, after the Lutherans had smashed all of the statues in churches, had broken out all of the stained glass windows, and insisted upon a transfer of authority from the church to the printed text of Scripture, it wasn't very long before Lutherans were putting up statues of themselves and putting themselves into stained glass windows, with only very nuanced differences between themselves and the Catholic churches around them. Truly, for those of you that were neither Lutheran nor Catholic, if this morning you had gone to a Missouri Synod Lutheran church for a service and then went to a Catholic church for a service, there's a good chance that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. The Lutheran Church reinvented itself as Catholic light in a way that rather reminded me of the final pages of Animal Farm, when the pigs who had led the rebellion against the farmers are later seen with the human farmers having dinner and playing cards in the farmhouse. Now, I don't think that Martin Luther was necessarily trying to usher in a new age of reason. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room. But given the context of when he lived and the oppressive control of the medieval Catholic Church, he was a 16th century superhero. But as Mencken points out, the Reformation substantially failed. Christians went right back to believing in the same magic and superstition that he had initially condemned. It makes me wonder, now that I have a long list of historical quotes of glaring insights from different periods in history, why traditional faith always seems to come back. Why is Islam more backward now than it was 50 years ago? Even the countries that we would say had embraced a moderate form of Islam, places like Turkey and Indonesia, have raced backwards towards a more conservative form of the church. The church that I grew up in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, that was a church that really valued scholarship and was a progressive, liberal church. As their numbers have dwindled, they have drifted to the right, to the right, to the right, to the point that I don't even recognize the writings of my own old friends. They have gone back into the womb. Are people afraid to think for themselves? Do they want an authoritarian government to protect them from an imaginary boogeyman. I mean, you really have to wonder about the popularity of someone like not just a Donald Trump, but many of the other Republican rivals for office. What is the attraction to an authority figure, even when you know that almost everything they say is either false or stupid? And yet there's some security that is conveyed by the thought of having a strong man there. Why is it that people will go back to a church whose tenets they absolutely do not believe? They absolutely, if you ask them, do you believe the earth is flat like it says in Genesis? No. Do you believe there are dragons that live in the oceans like it says in the Psalms? No, I don't believe. They don't believe what the book says, but they will go back to that as a moral authority. Are people afraid of critical thinking? Are they afraid to let themselves take responsibility for making their own decisions? I'll tell you honestly that I'm sincerely worried that the progressive Reformation of our generation may also fail. I've been astonished for years that as books that are as popular as the books written by Karen Armstrong and Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan and our good friend Bishop Spong, that millions of copies of those books are out there. People have attended their lectures and their conferences by the hundreds of thousands, who then turn around and go right back to their Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, UCC, and disciple churches and go right back to repeating creeds that they do not believe and participating in rituals that they know are little more than what H.L. Mencken calls a public magic show. Is there comfort in nostalgia? Is it literally whistling in the graveyard? And many people will tell me, Roger, it doesn't matter. Why do you let this stuff upset you? People will believe whatever they want to believe, and besides, religion doesn't change anything anyway. Is it all right if I object just a little bit to that? Because as Voltaire said, if you can get people to believe in absurdities, it isn't hard to get them to commit atrocities. You look at the blatant lies that we are told in this week by the NRA and by their gun manufacturing minions. They tell us that the Second Amendment protects the rights of all citizens to own any gun that they want. That isn't true. They keep saying it, but it clearly isn't true. You cannot own a machine gun. You cannot own a bazooka. You cannot own a tactical nuclear weapon. And the Second Amendment protects the existence of a well-regulated militia, which has nothing to do with privately amassing an arsenal of lethal weapons. The interpretation of the Second Amendment to give individuals the right to own guns under any circumstances was a hoax that was cooked up in 2008. This was not what the framers of the Constitution thought. This is what a Republican-dominated Supreme Court decided in the Heller case in 2008. And yet it is being reiterated as if it were true when everybody knows it is not true. There is no false judgment that is worse than the one written by Scalia in the 2008 Heller case. It's just not true. The NRA tells us that guns don't kill people. Then why do we give soldiers guns? And clearly, a person with a gun kills a lot more people than a person that doesn't have a gun. They kill 30,000 Americans every year, where gun deaths in Japan are always fewer than 10. Fewer than 10. We have 30,000. Most Western democracies measure their gun deaths per year in the dozens. We do it in the tens of thousands. And yet we are unable, not only is it illegal to regulate gun ownership, it is illegal for the CDC to keep records, to research the health hazard presented by gun ownership in America. They tell us that these guns used in mass shootings are not really automatic weapons. They're not even semi-automatic. They're just like other guns. Sure, if you want to parse words, which NRA people always do want to parse words, the AR-15 still requires that you pull the trigger to fire the weapon every time it shoots a bullet, but you can put a 100-round drum on it and you can fire 100 shots in less than 2 minutes, in which case they are a military-style weapon whose only purpose is to kill a lot of people in a short period of time. We keep talking about these shootings being a mental health problem. Well, in a sense, I agree. I mean, if you dismiss religious mythology and you try to talk about reality, let's just get very real. Assume that you are now an armchair psychologist if you're not really a psychologist. A person walks up to a gun counter and says, I would like to buy the weapon that was recently used to kill a bunch of children in a school shooting, or kill a bunch of people in a theater, or kill nearly 50 people in a nightclub. I want that gun. What other diagnostic criteria do you need? What are you looking for? Do they have to serve red wine with fish before you recognize that they're unstable? Clearly, the desire to own that weapon is a textbook definition of you are unsafe. I'm not sure that they shouldn't be handcuffed and taken out, but they certainly shouldn't be sold the gun. That person that says, I want to own a gun that they had in the news after San Bernardino or right after the shooting at Pulse, I want to own that gun. You go on a you can never own a gun of any kind list immediately, because the desire to have it is all the proof that you need that you are not safe. But beyond that individual and I went to Bass Pro Shop on Monday after the shooting on Sunday just to stand and watch who was going and looking at the AR-15s. And it was moms and dads with their preschool-age kids looking to buy that same gun. And the clerks, nobody seemed to even have a troubled look on their face. Everybody was all happy and friendly in this big, spacious sporting. Is the sport now shooting people? Sporting goods store were just real happy about their purchase of these very lethal weapons, protected by the United States Congress. Now, in class this morning, I referenced perhaps our congressmen were mentally ill, and I was told by someone that they weren't. They were just greedy and self-serving. But even still, you have a public school teacher who uses her own body to save a child, and then you have a legislator that won't do anything to save a child if it costs them a political donation. You have school teachers willing to give up their lives, and you have congressmen that are not willing to give up a political donation. Now, who's the leader in that context? I'm sorry, Kay, I think they might be crazy. I know you're not supposed to use that word as a diminishing write-off kind of word, but the words I would like to use to describe our Congress, I will not use while I'm being videoed. Catch me tomorrow night at Galloway, and I'll tell you what I think. The false narrative sold to Americans, I'm convinced, is rooted in how we are limbered up by the magical thinking of religion. When the former president of the United States told us that terrorists hate us because of our freedoms, did anybody believe that was a factual statement? That they hate us because of our freedoms? They don't hate us because we have occupied their country. They don't hate us because we've stolen their natural resources. They don't hate us because we have forced our culture down their throats. They don't hate us for installing an oppressive puppet government in their country. They don't hate us for drone strikes that have killed their children and women hanging out laundry. They hate us because we eat hot dogs and we wear bathing suits at the beach. Really? Is anyone dumb enough to believe that? Who could buy into such nonsense? And yet they say it over and over and over again, and then we end up acting like our soldiers are protecting our freedom. Do you know how many military bases the United States operates abroad? Anybody, take a guess. How many military bases do we have outside the United States? 130. Anybody else? More than 300 is correct. It's actually more than 700. We have 737 military bases around the globe. How many countries have a base in the United States? None. 737 bases scattered around the globe, many of which were initiated to help us win World War II. And best I recall from my history classes, that war is over. We are not fighting for our freedom. We are defending an empire. There is no way that you can say, was Afghanistan, they don't have a navy, they don't have an air force, were they going to ride camels over here and take our freedom away from us? How stupid would you have to be to believe that our soldiers are defending our freedom? They are defending Exxon, they are defending Mobil, they are defending the profits of Halliburton and General Electric. It has nothing to do with your individual freedom, and in fact, your individual freedoms are being taken away from you in the interest of serving military profits. Those of us who oppose these wars for oil are the ones who are defending our interests and, by the way, are supporting our soldiers. You support our soldiers, don't send them into harm's way to defend the profits of corporations that couldn't care less how many of them came back without arms or legs or eyes. This is plainly and undeniably true. So how did we all become such puppets of an empire? I blame the church for part of it. They force us to conform to believing obvious lies, and then when either the church or the government lies to us, we just nod in agreement. I don't know if the world is ready to wake up from the slumber of not being able to tell the difference between a dream world and the waking world, but I hope so. The goal of progressive faith is not to deny reality and believe in an imaginary world. It is to wake up and come to terms with the world that we actually live in and to work to make that world more peaceful, more fair, more just, and dare I say it, happier. Just to lead a decent, happy life. We have wasted enough time in having the wool pulled over our eyes. Let's come to terms with reality and then find the courage together to change reality.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.